The rain pounded the streets of San Francisco, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the city's usual hum. But it couldn't silence the scream of tires as Ethan Caldwell's motorcycle skidded to a stop outside the glittering Prescott estate. He yanked off his helmet, heart hammering, knowing he was about to walk into a deal with the deviler at least. The devil's spoiled son. By midnight, he'd be fake married to Julian Prescott, the city's most notorious trust fund playboy, all to save his family's crumbling vineyard. Ethan wasn't here for love. He was here for survival. His mother's hospital bills were piling up, and the bank was circling like vultures, ready to seize the only home he'd ever known. The deal was simple. Julian needed a husband to secure his inheritance, and Ethan needed the payout to keep his family afloat. A year of playing house, no strings attached, and they'd both walk away richer. At least, that was the plan. Julian Prescott lounged against the marble staircase in the mansion's foyer, a glass of bourbon dangling from his manicured fingers. His golden hair caught the chandelier's light, and his smirk was as sharp as the tailored suit clinging to his frame. Well, he drawled, eyeing Ethan's rain-soaked leather jacket and mud-streaked boots. The vineyard boy cleans up, almost. His voice dripped with mockery, but there was a flicker in his hazel eyes' curiosity. Maybe, or something hungrier. Don't start, Ethan growled, shaking water from his hair. I'm here to sign the papers, not stroke your ego. He strode past Julian, ignoring the way the other man's colonist sandalwood and sin made his pulse jump. This was business, nothing more. The lawyer, a stern woman named Ms. Hargrove, waited in the study with a stack of documents thicker than a Bible. 6 months, she said, sliding the contract across the desk. You live together, act like a couple in public, and convince the Prescott family board that this marriage is real. If you fail, Mr. Prescott loses his inheritance. And Mr. Caldwell, you get nothing. Ethan's jaw tightened. 6 months of pretending to love someone like Julian, the guy who'd once crashed a yacht into a pier because he was bored. This was going to be hell. Julian signed with a flourish, tossing the pen aside like it was a toy. Relax, farm boy, he said, leaning close enough that Ethan could feel the heat of his breath. I'm a fantastic actor. Just follow my lead, and we'll be fine. Ethan didn't trust that grin for a second, but he scrawled his name anyway. The ink felt heavier than it should, like he was signing away something more than just his time. Their first public appearance as a couple was at a charity gala in Napa Valley, where the elite sipped champagne and whispered about the scandalous new marriage. Ethan felt like a fish out of water, his borrowed tuxedo stiff and foreign against his skin. Julian, of course, was in his element, charming donors with a smile that could melt glaciers. But when he slipped his arm around Ethan's waist, his touch lingered a beat too long, and Ethan's stomach flipped in a way that wasn't entirely fake. You're tense, Julian murmured, his lips brushing Ethan's ear as they posed for photos. Smile, darling. We're madly in love. Remember? Ethan forced a grin, his hand tightening on Julian's hip in warning. Keep it up, and I'll show you how mad I can get, he muttered back, earning a low chuckle that sent a shiver down his spine. The night wasn't all glitz and games. During a quiet moment, Ethan overheard a board member grilling Julian about their relationship. You expect us to believe you settled down with him? The man sneered, gesturing at Ethan, a nobody from some failing vineyard. Julian's smile didn't waver, but his eyes turned to ice. Ethan's worth 10 of you, he said smoothly, and he's mine. The words were for show, but they hit Ethan like a freight train, stirring something dangerous in his chest. Back at Julian's penthouse, the pretense dropped. Ethan yanked off his tie, pacing the sleek living room. You didn't have to do that, he said. Defend me like I'm your real husband. Julian shrugged, pouring himself another drink. It's part of the act. Don't read into it. But his gaze lingered on Ethan. And for a moment, the air between them crackled with something neither dared to name. Living together was a war of wills. Julian's penthouse was a maze of glass and steel, nothing like the cozy chaos of Ethan's vineyard home. Every morning, Ethan woke to find Julian sprawled across the couch, half-dressed and hungover, blasting music that rattled the windows. You're a walking stereotype, Ethan snapped one day, snatching the remote to mute the speakers. And you're a buzzkill, Julian shot back, but there was no real venom in it. He propped himself up, shirt open to reveal a sliver of tanned skin, and grinned. Come on, loosen up. We're married, aren't we? Live a little. Ethan rolled his eyes, but he couldn't ignore the way Julian's teasing was starting to feel less like a taunt and more like an invitation. He threw himself into keeping Julian in line, dragging him to board meetings, forcing him to show up on time, even teaching him how to cook something that wasn't takeout. To his surprise, Julian didn't fight it. He complained. Sure, but he listened, his usual bravado softening under Ethan's steady hand. One night, after a particularly brutal day of dodging paparazzi and board scrutiny, they ended up on the penthouse balcony, sharing a bottle of wine from Ethan's vineyard. The city sparkled below, and Julian's shoulder brushed Ethan's as they leaned against the railing. Why do you care so much? Julian asked suddenly, his voice quieter than usual. About your vineyard. Your mom. All of it. Why fight so hard? Ethan stared at the horizon, the weight of the question pressing against his ribs. Because it's home, he said finally. It's the only place that ever felt like mine, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep it. Julian was silent for a long moment, then reached out, his fingers grazing Ethan's. You're not what I expected, he said softly. And for once, there was no smirk, no pretense, just Julian, raw and unguarded. Ethan's heart thudded, but he pulled his hand away. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Not when everything between them was built on a lie. The weeks blurred into a rhythm of public smiles and private battles. Ethan and Julian perfected their act, hand-holding at gallery openings, stolen glances at dinner parties, even a staged kiss for a tabloid photographer that left Ethan's lips burning long after the flash faded. But behind closed doors, the lines between performance and reality started to fray. Julian was a puzzle Ethan couldn't solve. 1 minute, he was the spoiled brat who'd order a $5,000 bottle of champagne just to see Ethan's reaction. The next, he was slipping into the kitchen to help chop vegetables, his hands clumsy but earnest. Ethan caught himself watching Julian more than he should, how his laugh softened when no one else was around, how his eyes lit up when Ethan talked about the vineyard's history. It was dangerous, this pull, and Ethan fought it with every ounce of stubborn will he had. One evening, a crisis hit. Ethan got a call from his sister, Lila, her voice trembling. The bank's moving faster than we thought, she said. They're auctioning the vineyard in 3 months unless we pay up. Ethan's world tilted, the penthouse's sterile walls closing in. He needed more time, more money, more than this fake marriage could give. Julian found him on the balcony, gripping the railing so hard his knuckles were white. What's wrong? He asked, and for once, his tone held no mockery, only concern. Ethan didn't want to tell him. Julian didn't know him anything beyond their deal. But the words spilled out anyway about his mom's cancer, the vineyard's debts, the fear of losing everything. Julian listened, his usual swagger gone. And when Ethan finished, he didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he said, we'll figure it out. Together. Together. Ethan scoffed, but his voice cracked. This isn't your fight, Julian. Maybe I want it to be, Julian replied, stepping closer. His hand hovered near Ethan's arm, then dropped. You're not the only one who's tired of pretending. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to unpack. Ethan turned away, his chest tight. He couldn't afford to believe Julian meant it not when so much was at stake. The board's scrutiny intensified. At a tense meeting in a sleek downtown office, a board member named Richard Voss grilled them relentlessly. You two don't even share a bedroom, he sneered, tossing photos of their separate living spaces onto the table. This marriage is a sham. Julian's hand found Ethan's under the table, squeezing hard. We're private people, he said smoothly, his thumb brushing Ethan's knuckles in a way that felt far too real. But if you want proof, we can give you a show right here. Ethan's face burned, but he played along, leaning into Julian's side. We're happy, he said, the lie tasting bitter. That's what matters. Voss wasn't convinced, but Julian's charm and Ethan's quiet intensity bought them time. Back at the penthouse, Ethan rounded on Julian. What the hell was that? You can't just... What? Julian interrupted, stepping into Ethan's space. Act like I care. Like I want this to work. His voice dropped, raw and unsteady. Maybe I'm not acting anymore. Ethan froze, his pulse racing. Julian's eyes were too close, too honest. And for a moment, Ethan wanted to close the distance, to see what would happen if he stopped fighting the pull. But he stepped back, shaking his head. Don't mess with me, Julian. Not about this. Julian's face fell, but he didn't push. Instead, he turned and disappeared into his room, leaving Ethan alone with the echo of what might have been. To keep up appearances, they started spending more time together real time, not just for show. Julian surprised Ethan by showing up at the vineyard one weekend, trading his designer clothes for jeans and a flannel shirt that looked absurdly good on him. They worked side by side, pruning vines and hauling crates. And Julian's usual complaints were replaced by a quiet focus that made Ethan's chest ache. You're not half bad at this, Ethan said, tossing him a water bottle as they took a break under an oak tree. Julian caught it, grinning. High praise from the Vineyard King. He paused, his smile softening. This place, it's special. I get why you fight for it. Ethan looked at him, really looked, and saw something new in Julian's eyes, something that mirrored the stubborn hope Ethan carried every day. For the first time, he let himself wonder if Julian could be more than a spoiled rich kid. If this marriage could be more than a contract. That night, back at the penthouse, Julian cooked dinner-burnt pasta, and all in they laughed until their sides hurt. As they sat on the couch, shoulders brushing, Julian's hand found Ethan's again. This time, Ethan didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and the silence between them was louder than any words. I don't know what this is, Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Julian's thumb traced circles on his hand. Me neither, he said, but I want to find out. The shift was subtle but seismic. What started as a charade became a dance of stolen glances and lingering touches. Ethan and Julian still bickered over Julian's late-night parties, Ethan's early morning workouts, but the arguments carried a new undercurrent, a heat that neither could ignore. They were playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were no longer just money or an inheritance. One night, a storm hit San Francisco, thunder rattling the penthouse windows. Ethan found Julian in the living room, staring at the rain, his usual confidence replaced by something fragile. I used to hate storms, Julian said, his voice soft. When I was a kid, I'd hide under the covers, thinking the world was ending. Ethan sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. And now, Julian turned, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. Now I've got you. The words broke something in Ethan. He reached out, cupping Julian's face, and kissed him. It wasn't like the staged kiss for the cameras. This was raw, desperate, a collision of need and fear. Julian kissed back, his hands fisting in Ethan's shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, gasping, Ethan's heart was a wildfire he couldn't contain. "We can't," Ethan said, but his hands were still on Julian, betraying his words. "Why not?" Julian challenged, his voice rough. "Because it's fake. Or because you're scared it's real." Ethan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that Julian was under his skin, and no amount of logic could change that. The board's next test was brutal, a weekend retreat at the Prescott family's Lake Tahoe estate, where Ethan and Julian would be under a microscope. Every gesture, every word would be dissected by Voss and the other board members, who were itching for a reason to call their marriage a fraud. The estate was a sprawling monument to wealth, all polished wood and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Ethan felt like an intruder, but Julian navigated the space with ease, charming aunts and uncles while keeping Ethan close. At night, they shared a bedroom for appearances, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. On the second night, after a dinner where Voss had grilled them again, Julian pulled Ethan onto the balcony. The stars were sharp above the lake, and Julian's hand was warm in his. "They're never going to believe us," Julian said, his voice low. "Not unless we give them something undeniable." Ethan frowned. "Like what?" Julian's answer was a kiss, slow and deliberate, right where the board could see. It was a performance, but it felt like a confession. When they pulled back, Ethan's face was flushed, and Julian's eyes were bright with something that looked dangerously like hope. The board bought it for now, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, not just with the board, but with each other. Back in the city, the cracks in their facade widened. Ethan's sister called with worse news. The bank had moved the auction date up. They had 6 weeks. Ethan threw himself into work, spending long hours at the vineyard, avoiding Julian and the feelings he couldn't untangle. But Julian wouldn't let him hide. One evening, Julian showed up at the vineyard unannounced, his car kicking up dust on the dirt road. "You can't keep running from this," he said, striding toward Ethan, who was knee-deep in pruning. "From us." "There is no us," Ethan snapped, but his voice wavered. "This is a deal, Julian. A contract." "Bullshit," Julian said, grabbing Ethan's arm. "You feel it too. Don't lie to me." Ethan yanked free, his chest heaving. "And what happens when this is over? You go back to your parties, your money, your life, and I'm left with nothing." Julian's face crumpled. "You think that's what I want? To go back to that?" He stepped closer, his voice breaking. "I've never felt more alive than I do with you." Ethan wanted to believe him, wanted it so badly it hurt. But fear was a powerful thing, and it kept him silent, watching as Julian walked away, shoulders slumped. The final weeks were a pressure cooker. The board's deadline loomed, and Ethan's vineyard was slipping through his fingers. He and Julian barely spoke, their once easy banter replaced by a strained silence. But Julian didn't give up. He showed up at the vineyard daily, hauling crates, learning the land, proving he was more than the spoiled kid Ethan had met months ago. One night, Ethan found Julian in the vineyard's old barn, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. "What's this?" Ethan asked, his voice rough from exhaustion. Julian looked up, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. "I've been talking to investors, people who owe me favors. I'm trying to save your vineyard. Ethan's throat tightened. Why? Because I love you, Julian said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And I'm done pretending I don't. The words hit Ethan like a tidal wave. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling Julian into a kiss that was all fire and apology. They stumbled against the barn wall, hands desperate, hearts open. For the first time, Ethan let himself believe this could be real. The final board meeting was a battlefield. Voss presented evidence of their separate lives, their initial contract, everything designed to tear them apart. But Julian stood, his voice steady, and told the truth not about the deal, but about them. I married Ethan for the wrong reasons, he said, his hand finding Ethan's. But I'd do it again for the right ones. He's shown me what it means to fight for something real, to love something simian more than yourself. Ethan's heart pounded as he added, this started as a lie, but it's the truest thing I've ever known. The board deliberated for hours. When they returned, Voss's scowl said it all, they'd won. Julian's inheritance was secure, and Ethan's payout would save the vineyard. But the real victory came later, under the stars at the vineyard. Julian, no longer the spoiled young master, stood beside Ethan, their hands entwined. I don't want this to end, Julian said, his voice vulnerable but sure. Ethan smiled, pulling him close. It doesn't have to. They rebuilt together Ethan's vineyard, Julian's heart, their life. The fake marriage became a real one, not because of contracts or money, but because they chose each other, night after night, flaws and all. And as they stood in the vineyard, the earth beneath their feet and the future wide open, Ethan knew they'd never stop fighting for this. For them.